Welcome to the first episode of Freya for John Anderson Media. It's an absolute privilege to be here. This is a new show that we're launching on John Anderson's platform. My background is in politics. I ran as a candidate in the New South Wales election a couple of years ago, and I've been a host on Sky News, worked at think tanks in policy development, and really what I want this show to be is a place where we have honest conversations, we deal with hard truths, and we have deep analysis. It is so easy to get distracted in the noise, in the news cycle, and it's easy to know a lot about stuff at a shallow level, but I want to go into a few topics really deeply, because only when we are armed with the truth can we confront the lies that our culture and our world so frequently tells us. I think one of the main lies and deceptions that a lot of people, particularly young people, have been told is that empathy and tolerance, these are the main virtues we should try to cultivate. This is just wrong. If you have empathy detached from any sense of truth or justice, you end up defending people that are actually opposed to your very existence. I think about the UK with the grooming gangs. We feel so empathetic for migrants and for people from different backgrounds that we end up tolerating injustices against our own women. Of course we need to be empathetic. Of course we need to be compassionate, but we must first of all stand for truth and for justice. Another lie we've been told is that all cultures are equal. If anything, actually every culture other than Western Judeo-Christian culture is actually better than our own. This has led to massive amounts of shame and hopelessness, but it is also manifestly untrue. If every culture were equal and there were nothing special about the West, why do millions of people migrate to Western countries every year? How many people migrate from China to the US every year? And how many people go the reverse way? Very, very few. And there's a reason for that. Because whether we can admit it or not, there is something special. There is something unique and wonderful about our civilization that makes it the most attractive place to be in the world. And we've got to protect and defend that. But it starts by acknowledging that what we have is worth fighting for. I think another lie we've been told is that the feminism of the 1960s has been overwhelmingly positive for people and particularly women. But I think what it's actually done is fragment the family, lead to broken homes, disempower men, and ultimately hurt women. Of course, we should want women to have rights and dignity and respect, but we can get that from our biblical tradition. The Bible says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. Be ready to lay down your life for her. That is the ultimate example of love and dignity for women. But what feminism has given us is this idea that there is nothing different between men and women. In fact, there is so little difference between them that men can actually become women, and that motherhood is not important, that the family should not be valued, and the ultimate successful woman is somebody who is independent and essentially becomes like a man, has a career, rejects family, rejects motherhood. But I actually think if you think about it, it's made women deeply, deeply unhappy. When we have detached sex from commitment and responsibility, we've given men all the benefits with none of the responsibilities. That's led to broken homes, a generation of children who've grown up without fathers. In fact, that's now become multiple generations. And by liberalizing sex, we've also been forced to liberalize abortion. That's not good for anyone. The most dangerous place for a child now is in their mother's womb. How have we let this happen? Well, these are just a few of the lies and deceptions I think we've been told by our culture, but very few people are willing to call them out. That's what this show is going to be about, examining the core beliefs that many of us have inherited from the education system, from our culture, from social media, and really investigating them. Are they true? Are they good? What fruits do they produce in our society. And I think we'll find as we drill down, the further we have strayed from our biblical roots as a civilization, the further we have strayed from goodness, justice, beauty, all of those things that actually create the conditions for human flourishing. As Os Guinness says, we are like cut flowers. Our civilization is blooming for now, but cut off from the roots, we are already dying. Now let's turn to Iran. I had a whole show planned and then the strikes on Iran started and we had to kind of chuck everything out the window and turn our attention to this. This is a historic moment where we are seeing for the first time in the Iranian regime's 47-year history a real possibility that the end could be here. The US and Israel launched their strikes on Iran starting Saturday evening Australian time, and they've now taken out a number of key military figures, political figures, and also military infrastructure. But I want to turn our attention to the coverage that these events have received here in Australia. The ABC, which is our national broadcaster and who receives around $1 billion in funding from taxpayers every year, did not disappoint with its very biased one-side coverage of the events. John Lyons, who is, I honestly don't know what his deal really is and why they keep him around when he is clearly extremely biased against Israel and the West. But here was his take that apparently Albanese supporting the strikes, it's all just political propaganda.
Another interesting thing about Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong and Richard Marles' statement, that first sentence, Australia stands with the brave people of Iran in their struggle against oppression. To me, that is political propaganda. What they actually mean, they don't say it, but what that sentence should say, if they're being accurate, if the Prime Minister of Australia is telling the truth, it should say Australia stands with Israel and the US in their new war on Iran.
Here's what John Lyons doesn't seem to be able to understand. Standing with Israel and the US is standing with the Iranian people. 90 million people, the population of Iran, are essentially being held hostage by this tyrannical Islamo-fascist regime. The majority of the population does not support the regime. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, around 30,000 people were killed by the regime for daring to protest against them. So if John had a shred of intellectual honesty, what he would say is, yes, Australia is supporting Israel and the US, but that is because, as Albanese noted, we stand with the people of Iran. I think this just speaks to perhaps his deep anti-Western bias that he doesn't want to admit. Maybe the West is on the right side of history with this one. But then he goes on and he talks about how the US is no longer a credible player in the international space, and really, China, they are the best independent negotiators. Now, I'm sorry, but this is just so absurd. If you think China is really an independent negotiator or actor in this conflict, you have to be frankly, delusional. I think a lot of the long-term implications of these strikes will be the message it sends to China. Because remember, Trump gave Iran an option. Come to the table and negotiate on your missiles and on nuclear enrichment, or pay the price. Face the consequences. He also said if the regime starts massacring protesters, he will come to their aid. What Trump has done time and time again is actually back up what he's saying with action. Now, think about how that's going to play out for China. They've said by 2027 they will invade Taiwan. This is the timeline that they've given publicly and privately. If Trump is going to have effective deterrence against China, they need to actually believe what he says and take his threats seriously. That is the signal that these strikes send to China. Oh my goodness, we actually have to believe the US. When they say they're going to blow us up, they mean it. Maybe we should rethink our invasion of Taiwan. That is the true message here. Also keep in mind, since the US captured Maduro and Venezuela stopped supplying crude oil to China, they've had to turn to Iran. China is very dependent on Iran for energy, and they're part of this axis of instability: China, Russia, Iran. If you can start teasing them away from each other, pulling that alliance apart, each of them will be weakened, including China. So China, of course, does not have an interest in seeing a weak Iran. They want a strong Iran, and they've condemned the US's strikes naturally. So this more biased coverage from John Lyons is just proof that I think the ABC is completely out of touch with average Australians, and also seems to platform views that are contrary to our national interest and contrary to reality. Now, another criticism that I've seen floating around coming from elements of the MAGA base and also the left is that this is a regime change war and it's an Iraq 2.0. But really, as Neil Ferguson put it, he wrote a brilliant article for the Free Press. This is not regime change. This is regime alteration. This is step one. Step one is decapitating the head of the octopus, which is Khamenei, and the key leaders within the Iranian regime. But step two is the Iranian people themselves actually have to step up and bring about that regime change. So it's not Iraq 2.0. And the other thing that is different to Iraq is that the US tried to essentially step in and run Iraq. There is no intention from Israel or the US or anyone for that matter that they want to step in and run Iran. It's been made very clear time and time again that is for the Iranian people to do. And it comes back to what is the fundamental goal. The fundamental goal of this conflict is not freedom or liberal democracy, but it is decapitating the regime. I hope for freedom. I hope for democracy. I hope that the people of Iran can overthrow the regime. But fundamentally, that is up to them to do. And I think the strikes by Israel and the US is a way where they can, in a way that's politically feasible and militarily makes sense, they can go in and they can assist the Iranian people. But this is not a regime change war. And I also don't think it's a war that's going to last very long because the regime is very, very weak. Now, apart from all the left-wing media going into a meltdown, social media having a fit, we've also seen literally within hours of the strikes, left-wing protesters taking to the streets around the Western world. Now, the first thing is, it's always funny how basically these people will fly every other flag other than the American flag or the Australian flag or the flag of the country that they actually live in. So within hours, there were protests in New York run by the People's Forum. This is the same group that was behind the pro-Venezuela protests and the pro-Mexico protests, and way before that, the pro-Ukraine protests. This is a group that will basically support any country other than the country they actually belong in. And the other peculiarity is, if you notice in the footage of the protest, they're all carrying signs that clearly had to be printed, probably at great expense. So you have to ask, how within hours of a military strike do they already have thousands of people out on the streets with paraphernalia ready to go, ready to protest? Is this really an organic movement, or is this something far more sinister? Now, the People's Forum is a good example of how external actors who hate the US are funding protest movements to undermine us from within. The main funder of the People's Forum is a man called Neville Singham Roy. He's an IT entrepreneur that sold his business back in 2017 for nearly $1 billion. He then migrated to Shanghai, and he's been a lifelong Maoist and supports communism. Not the kind of guy you want in the US anyway. But Singer Roy has now channeled millions and millions of dollars through various shell companies, dodgy funding pathways, into protest groups in the United States, whose job it is to mobilize against the US, against the US government, and sow discord. Now, it's actually a strategy that the Chinese Communist Party has adopted for many years. It is the strategy of sowing discord, and it's a concept rooted in Chinese military philosophy, specifically the 36 stratagems that is actually often attributed to Sun Tzu, he was a famous Chinese military strategist. But the idea is that you use tactics to sow internal division within the adversary's society, government, military, or alliances that distracts them from external conflicts and also reduces their willingness to fight. Now, it's an example of non-kinetic warfare, and this is the approach we know countries, specifically China, are taking. They take a whole of society approach. We want to undermine the whole of the Western society, especially from within, so that we weaken their will to fight and cause disunity. But I think what these protests show is that this is not just a battle between the US and Iran. This is not just a battle over the Iranian regime itself, but the response we've seen on the left to immediately come out in defense of an Islamo-fascist terrorist regime shows that we are actually in a battle for Western civilization itself. There are forces, including in our own country, that do not want to see us prevail. They want to see the West destroyed. And these protests show not only are they there in their thousands, but they're well funded as well. We have to see this threat for what it is, which is very serious. Now, also interestingly, the response to the strikes on Iran has been very disturbing across the West. The protests, the media coverage, the social media, but also in Austin, Texas, we've now seen a mass shooting. At the time that I'm recording this, 2 people have died and about a dozen more have been injured. Now, this was allegedly a naturalized US citizen, originally from Senegal, wearing a hoodie that said "Property of Allah," a t-shirt underneath with the Iranian flag. A Quran was in his car, and he came to a venue in Austin, Texas, and shot the place up. Now, of course, this is all a legend, and we will see more information come out in the coming days, but it's extremely disturbing to think there are people, especially the idea that there are people who migrated to the West to enjoy the prosperity we offer, who are taking to the streets and killing people in retaliation to what the US has done in Iran. It's highly disturbing. And in Australia, so far, there are 4 separate mosques that are hosting memorial services for the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. 4 mosques in Australia so far. Probably more to come, hosting memorial services. I'm sorry, but if you're in Australia and you are mourning the death of a jihadist, psychotic, terroristic, Islamo-fascist dictator from Iran, you should not be in this country. I want to know how you got here. I want to know who let you in, and then I want to make sure you leave very, very quickly. Being in Australia is a privilege. It's not a right. And I would say if you're mourning Khamenei, you should lose that right, quick smart, because it says something about where your loyalties lie, where your allegiances lie. And I would also say, given he is somebody who has executed and permitted the execution of thousands of people, Iran themselves directed 2 terrorist attacks on Australian soil just in the last couple of years, you are a direct threat to Australia's national security. But here we are. This is the position we're in as a country. We have imported hatred. We have imported people that hate our values, hate our country, hate our way of life, and are mourning a psychotic Islamic dictator. Our immigration policy has clearly failed. But those are just the cultural results of a bad immigration policy. Disharmony, lack of social cohesion, radicalization, ethnic enclaves, sectarianism. But immigration also has disastrous effects when not managed properly on our own people as well. We've just seen some new data around housing affordability come out, and it shows that there is now not a single capital city in Australia that is affordable for first home buyers. So if you're looking to buy your first home, good luck, because there is no city where the average first home buyer could actually buy a house. Now, the consequences of this are massive. Firstly, less children. If you don't have the security of owning a home, you won't feel secure enough to start a family. Depopulation. If you look at the internal migration data, Australians are actually leaving capital cities and going to the regions, and they're being replaced by hundreds of thousands of migrants. But that's not fair. We should be able to raise our kids in the same area where we were raised. That is kind of what we deserve as Australian citizens, and something's gone wrong if that's not able to happen. Social disconnection as people leave communities and get uprooted from where they've spent their whole lives, and also a lack of hope. If you don't own a home, if you don't have a stake in this country's future, why would you feel hopeful about where we're headed? Now, I want to address some of the drivers of why this is happening, because housing and housing costs are a major anxiety for a lot of young people in Australia. Now, a lot of people will say, it's supply, it's supply, it's supply, it's supply. All we have to do is just deregulate, give the government planning powers, override councils, and we'll fix the issue. But that's actually not true. Australia is remarkably good at building per capita. We have one of the highest dwelling construction rates per capita among our peer countries, higher than Canada and the US. So why is our housing affordability so bad? Well, because no matter how much we build, we've still got immigration coming in at such a high rate that it means we can't ever build enough. Net overseas migration is now accounting for 80% of population growth. And these migrants aren't going into work in the construction sector. Only 3.2% of migrants who arrived in the last decade are working in construction. That compares to the native-born population, where it's about 5%. So they're coming in, they're needing houses and places to live. They're not building any more houses. All it's doing is driving up the cost and pushing Australians out. Now, the main driver, when you actually look at it, the main driver of this massive immigration are temporary arrivals. And when you drill down into temporary arrivals even further, it's international students. There are nearly 1.1 million international students in Australia. That's 1 in every 25 people living in our country are international students. And this is, I hate to say it, but basically a rort for big businesses and multi-billion dollar universities, and the costs are being externalized and paid by young Australians, and for that matter, every Australian that wants to get into the housing market. Now, you might hear that international students are a $50 billion export. They're one of Australia's largest exports. But that is kind of accounting trickery. They count the money earned in Australia as an export, even though they earned the money working in Australia, and we know that working rights is one of the big reasons people want to come as an international student. So that doesn't really make sense. And also, these figures don't account for the money that international students send from Australia, earned in Australia, and sent back to their home countries. So really, some economists estimate the true export figure might be half of that, 25 billion. It's also claimed that international students support 250,000 jobs, but that also doesn't account for the jobs that those international students fill themselves. So of course, if you've got an extra 1.1 million people in the country, there are going to be more jobs. But most of the international students themselves actually work as well. So how many of those jobs are going to Australians? And are those jobs actually good, productive jobs? Because what we have seen is a massive bloating of the bureaucracy at our big universities funded by international student fees. I really don't know. Many of those, that if you're doing a, PhD in gender studies, or you're an HR manager of DEI at Sydney University, is that really a productive job? Probably not. And then there's the impact on the housing market. As much as some economists want to deny it, as much as big business and the universities want to deny it, 7% of Australia's private rental market is taken up by international students. And it's 20% in inner Sydney and Melbourne. 1 in 5 rental properties is being occupied by an international student. And then what happens is these students come to Australia, earn workers' rights, and then once the degrees are over, they move on to a bridging visa, and then they appeal that endlessly. And then you have people who've been in this country for years, and really being an international student was just an expensive way to a visa. This is deeply, deeply unfair. Now, we've got the federal budget coming up in May, and Labor is already prepping people to potentially scale back the capital gains tax discount or adjust negative gearing. But the reality is that although adjusting with tax settings might seem like a way we could fix the housing crisis, it's not going to do anything unless we address the fundamental driver of demand, which is immigration. All that scaling back CGT or negative gearing will do is actually technically increase taxes, increase government coffers, and this is already a government that's collecting a lot of tax. That is not the solution. The solution here is to reduce demand by significantly cutting immigration. And these consequences of mass migration and uncontrolled immigration, with people jumping to bridging visas and appeals and staying in the country for a lot longer than was initially intended, it's not just an economic erosion of our standard of living or our ability to buy a home or exacerbating the cost of living crisis, but there's actually a deeper cultural issue here. The US's national security strategy actually says mass migration is a national security threat. Who a country admits into its borders, in what numbers and from where, will inevitably define the future of that nation. Any country that considers itself sovereign has the right and duty to define its future. Throughout history, sovereign nations prohibited uncontrolled migration and granted citizenship only rarely to foreigners who also had to meet demanding criteria. The West's experience over the past decades vindicates this enduring wisdom. And some of the consequences that the national security strategy cites, the consequences of mass migration, are crime, weakened social cohesion, distorted labour markets, and undermined national security. It ends with saying, the era of mass migration must end. There you have it. This is not just an economic problem, this is a cultural problem, and it's a national security problem, because you cannot have a sovereign nation with hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of people who don't share your values, your history, your faith, your way of life. It just cannot work. And we're not doing ourselves any favors in this department either. Not only do we already have a lot of people in this country who don't share our values, but we're apparently bringing even more in. The Labor government is conniving to bring back ISIS brides. These are women who willingly joined the Islamic State Caliphate, renouncing their allegiance to Australia, joining a literal death cult. And now that ISIS has lost and they're in camps in Syria, funnily enough, they want to come back. Here's the thing. You do not get to join the other side of a war and then demand that the country you abandoned and you betrayed take you back once you realize the side you joined is actually losing. Now, they're bringing out their kids and saying, oh, well, this is really unfair for my children who are Australians. They shouldn't be going through this. I have sympathy. I really do. Those children did not ask for this. But also, as a parent, your child's welfare and well-being is your responsibility, not the state's. Certainly not ours to fix. You made an active decision to join ISIS, unless there was coercion or you were groomed or something like that. You made a willing decision to join ISIS. Many of them brought their children over with them or had the children when they were over there. That should have been something you thought about before joining ISIS. I'm sorry. I know it's harsh, but we have to actually defend our borders and say to people who we know have joined a caliphate. And one of the interesting aspects of this is the main person who has been behind the push to repatriate these women and their children is a man called Dr. Jamal Rifi. He's a key ally of Labor Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke and was also one of the people that saved Burke's seat from the Muslim vote, which was a group set up to get more Muslims elected into parliament. They were targeting Labor seats like Tony Burke's. He's behind this. We know they've had meetings together. He was also given 34 passports to enable these Islamists to come back to the country. Contrary to the usual rules, you should not be able to carry other people's passports around, let alone hand deliver them to Syria. And also issuing these temporary passports also generally requires ministerial intervention. So not only do these women want to come back, but it seems as though potentially they have been aided and abetted by a key ally of the Home Affairs Minister with potentially government cooperation. Now, we're not going to be told any of this, of course. Labor's denying it publicly. But when you look at how this is unfolded, it is highly, highly, highly unlikely that they didn't know exactly what was going on. This is the problem. We have to actually stand up for who we are as a nation. We have to defend our borders. And in this instance, we know exactly who these people are. We know they've joined a terrorist group. Why on earth would we bring them back? Now, Australia's problems with radical Islam don't stop there. The ABC has conducted a 2-year investigation into the resurgence of ISIS in Australia, and they've found evidence of systematic beatings and bashings of gay people by ISIS sympathizers. Now, what these teenagers, largely teenagers behind this, hence why none of them have actually been convicted. One was convicted of a robbery offense, but then able to walk free. But what they would do is they downloaded a dating app for teenagers, would lure gay men into parks or remote places, and then beat them and film the attacks. In some of them, they called them kafir dogs, which means, unbelieving dogs. They said we don't get sins for it because they're gay. And then in another video, one of the attackers yelled, "Islamic State lives." Now, there's evidence that these attacks went on for months, possibly even years, and many of them are going unreported, so we don't even know the full extent of it. This is deeply disturbing that no one's really been held accountable for this. It's happened, and it happened without any punishment or any police intervention for months on end, and it's happening in Australia. Now, this is not an issue about LGBTQ rights. This is an issue about basic human decency. Nobody in Australia should be beaten up, bashed, robbed, attacked, left unconscious on the pavement because of who they are. That's just not how we live here. That is not on. Yet that's what's been able to occur. Now, and part of the problem is I think people are getting it wrong. Even in the ABC article, Someone said, advocates say this case reflects a broader structural failure in which anti-LGBTQIA plus violence is underreported, inadequately investigated, insufficiently prosecuted, and too often met with lenient penalties. I don't think it's anti-LGBT violence that is under-investigated. I think it's radical Islamic violence that is under-investigated. That makes it sound like it's our problem this is happening. Oh, well, we're just not policing things well enough. We just don't have enough laws around hate crimes for LGBT people. But that's not the problem here. We shouldn't need extra laws to protect gay people. This shouldn't be happening in the first place. And I think, unfortunately, in the West, we are so eager to see multiculturalism succeed because so many leaders for so long have thrown all their eggs in this basket that we are often unwilling to confront the evil that can sometimes result when you have people from such different and frankly repressive backgrounds coming to our country. Now, one of the perpetrators behind these beatings, he has family who left Australia to join ISIS in Syria. And this is a kid that is now clearly carrying on those radical beliefs. Australia has a serious problem with radical Islam, and this is yet more evidence, but even still, people are unwilling to confront it for what it is, which is radical Islam, and claiming, oh, this is just LGBT violence. No, it's not. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.